The main thing that I think we need to see is accountability and transparency, and we also need to see really strong commitments from government.
The world's energy usage isn't going to go to zero, but somehow the carbon has to.
We need to make sure that countries that have been left out of development through fossil fuels or because of, let's be real, the historical impact of colonization, then we need to make sure those countries are properly compensated and supported because we do have one atmosphere.
I actually think this has been a very good COP for climate realism.
Hello and welcome to Connected. I'm Divya Gopalan. We cannot negotiate with nature. The climate cannot compromise. The writing is on the wall for dirty energy, and failure is not an option. That's the messaging from some of the key players at COP28. A record number of delegates attended this year's UN climate talks in Dubai, with plenty of encouraging statements and pledges. But are countries really committed to taking the necessary action to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius? And how much of what they're saying is, well, just hot air? Well, to gauge the impact of the climate talks, we're joined from London by Nate Maynard, an environmental consultant and the host and co-creator of Waste Not, Why Not, a podcast focused on sustainable practices. And from COP28 in Dubai, Angelica Oung, an independent energy reporter and analyst. Thank you both so much for being on the program today. Now, both of you had some expectations ahead of this summit. Nate, you were in Dubai also before returning back to London. Angelica, you're still there. And both of you recorded a statement for us on what you hope will happen during the summit. Take a listen.
The thing that I think we need to see is accountability and transparency, and we also need to see really strong commitments from government. That's the purpose of COP28, is to get national commitments from government, and we need to see those in order to really strengthen the work here. We also need a better linkage between ocean, biodiversity, and climate. We need a better way to communicate this to the public. I think that's another hope for COP that I have this year, is given that it's one of the largest COPs, I really hope this breaks into the mainstream and this isn't just a really big festival where people are coming and working on climate issues.
It's not lost upon any of us that we are in the United Arab Emirates, which is an oil and gas exporting country. But I also feel like that is a part of reality. The world is not going to stop using fossil fuels tomorrow. And we have to deal with not just how to stop, but what to use instead, because unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, the world's energy usage isn't going to go to zero, but somehow the carbon has to.
All right, Nate, how did the summit so far live up to your expectations?
Well, there's been a lot of really big commitments from countries. We have the Loss and Damages Fund. We have a commitment to triple renewable electricity and also energy efficiency, which is quite welcome. And frankly, there's been so many large commitments at COP, it's hard to keep track. I was chuckling a bit watching the video just because there is a major communications gap that still exists. If you read the conversation online, if you talk to people, as you're flying back from Dubai, I'm not sure the average person is aware of what's happening at COP28, or maybe they have quite a cynical view, especially of what's happening geopolitically at the moment. And of course, with oceans, there's still a large funding gap that remains. There needs to be about $40 billion per year in financing for blue carbon solutions, but we're only about $0.2 billion per year on average from 2017 to 2021. So in some ways, my hope has increased and changed slightly at COP, but we still have a long way to go.
Angelica, what do you make of COP? Or did it reach at least some of your expectations?
Well, I'm actually tremendously encouraged. I am a reporter, but at this COP, I'm really more of a climate activist, specifically promoting nuclear energy as being a part of the solution to our climate crisis. And I actually think this has been a very good COP for climate realism. Finally, nuclear energy is given a place at the table. So in addition to the double down on efficiency and triple up on renewable energy pledge that Nate talked about, that was signed by, I think by now, 140 different countries or something, there was a pledge to triple nuclear energy by 2050. And it was signed by a much smaller number of countries. I think by now, 24 have signed that pledge. But they represent something like almost half of the world's GDP. And it is the first step in including nuclear as a part of our climate solutions. In addition to nuclear, I also heard a lot of really good nitty-gritty conversation walking in the green zone, blue zone, people having conversations about how to abate sectors, about green steel, how to decarbonize, aviation. And things that are kind of hard to talk about, like are we going to stop using fossil fuels completely, or are we going to find a way to decarbonize our use?
Well, you've made some really, really good points that I want to delve in further as we get through this program. But one of the surprisingly quick decisions made at the summit was the consensus on the Loss and Damages Fund. Now, for years, wealthy nations rejected setting up compensation for their share of planet heating emissions. It is estimated that losses and damages in the developing countries fall between $100 billion and $580 billion a year. Now, Nate, can you first just give us your overview on this Loss and Damages Fund and whether you feel the work or the attention being given to it is adequate?
Well, it's a concept that's been talked about at COP for quite a long time. Even back in the 90s, I was hearing from a delegate who was explaining that Vanuatu first proposed a climate insurance fund, which would have been very similar to the Loss and Damages Fund today. So depending on how you look at it, it might have taken 30 years for this to come about as a concept. And yeah, as you stated, there is a massive funding gap. So we're already starting to see climate impacts in the countries that have the least ability to mitigate those impacts. And it's anywhere from, up to $500 billion. I've seen estimates of $400 billion. So this fund only covers $700 million. That's what's pledged so far. And COP's not over. I think that, Loss and Damages Fund is great, but we need lots of different types of climate adaptation. And that's going to be different for each type of country there. COP is a negotiation, it's agreement, it's through the UN, it's multilateral, but that's not stopping other countries from, proposing their own types of mitigation, adaptation, and recovery and resilience.
Right, and the Asia-Pacific region has very much, particularly in the South Pacific, its own set of needs. Now, Yiting Lu, project coordinator for the environmental action group Mom Loves Taiwan, talks about why it is in Taiwan's interest for this to come to fruition.
This is an agenda related to survive for many Pacific islands. So these islands countries are also very important to Taiwan too, because they are very important partner in international socials or international nations. They are always be with Taiwan. So I think their survival issues is our focus, and they are very, very important development allies in international. So the fund is very important to them because there are many details in facing extreme climate change issues.
Now, Angelica, as mentioned, many of Taiwan's allies will be affected by various climate crises. Why do you think it's important for Taiwan to follow through on these pledges or on the bigger pledges the rest of the world is making, particularly because it's not bound by it as it's not part of the United Nations?
I think it is tremendously important, and I'm really afraid that Taiwan, while we're making all the right noises, are actually not going in the right direction. If you look at President Tsai, she made the pledge for Taiwan to get net zero by 2050. But if you look at our actual emissions, especially with us shutting down nuclear, I just don't see us as having a viable path to that. I believe that given Taiwan's sensitive situation, there is no Taiwan pavilion here. It's all the more important for us to engage by doing. And I think when other countries see us doing the right thing in step with the other nations, that gives us that makes them feel our good faith in wanting to be a part of the world community.
Right. And speaking of the world community, I want to take it to another part of the world, or someone who represents another part of the world. Along with Taiwan's diplomatic allies in the South Pacific, many coastal areas, both here and other nations in the region, are also under threat. Alfredo Coro II is the mayor of Del Carmen Nata municipality in one of the eastern Philippine islands. He's pushing for more focus on the vulnerable coastal regions. Have a listen.
For COP28, we're very grateful that for the first time in 28 years, the COP has recognized local actions as very critical in this global arena of issues trying to address climate change. When everything is said and done, implementation is going to be always local. And that's why we are here, trying to raise the voice of the local community, especially in the coast, where often it is neglected because we focus too much on cities. But in terms of understanding and appreciating all these different supply chains, most of our fish are really coming from artisanal fisher folks that are directly served in our homes. And without supporting these artisanal fisher folks and our coastal communities and our coastal municipalities, then we disrupt a supply chain that allows us access to good food, reasonably priced food, and becomes food for all.
Now, Nate, you already touched on this at the beginning when you were giving your expectations, or you were looking back on your expectations. But you did mention talking about the oceans and basically talking about kind of the whole idea of most of our Earth's surface being affected by climate change, and many of the decisions are being made. But do you feel like enough attention is being paid to this? And can you elaborate a bit more on what people need to be focusing on more?
Sure, that's a great question. So I first was interested in the ocean, how it related to climate, when I went to COP21, and I went with an NGO, the same one I went with to Dubai, Global Ocean Trust. And there we were advocating to include ocean and blue carbon solutions inside INDCs, intended nationally declared contributions, along with just making it possible to have blue carbon projects. You know, it's been 7 COPs since then, and the progress is extraordinary. We're now talking seriously about decarbonizing shipping through hydrogen ammonia. It's, you know, there's a large presence of marine science institutions in blue carbon, but all of those ocean and nature pavilions were right at the exit of the blue zone, kind of pushed off to the side. And, you know, some talks I attended were well, they weren't very high in attendance. Maybe online there was a lot of people, but there's still, you know, a major focus on energy, rightly so, for this COP. And I think we're kind of missing these opportunities to solve, you know, quality of life challenges, food security challenges in low-income countries. If we lose coral, that's, you know, 500 million people get their direct source of protein from the oceans. And if we lose coral, that's going to be a serious human rights situation and, you know, quality of life as well.
Angelica, Taiwan has a pretty large fishing industry, and of course, you know, it's an island or islands, and has many coastal areas that will be affected by climate change. Can you tell us your concerns about that, and whether you feel that the Taiwan delegation is paying enough attention to it?
Well, I'm actually here with a nuclear delegation, and I'm the only Taiwanese person here, and it's been actually very hard to meet up with other Taiwanese delegates. But I will say, I will pick up on Nate's point that the ocean is a tremendous resource, and you've heard more about this at COP than I've ever personally heard myself, and a lot of it has to do with carbon dioxide removal. If you think of us as being on a leaky vessel, if you have a ship that has sprung a leak, it's important to patch the leak. But if your vessel have already taken on a lot of water, you actually need to bail out that vessel. That's carbon dioxide removal. And the ocean is playing a surprisingly large role in that, because by changing the alkalinity of the ocean, you can actually affect how much of a carbon sink it can function as. And those projects are still very expensive, but they're starting to look quite promising. And so whether it's in Taiwan or all over the world, I take Nate's point very well, that the ocean and taking care of the ocean is a vital part of how we solve this problem.
Angelica, I'm so glad you brought up carbon dioxide removal, as our next voice here gives us a bit more perspective. Now, one of the focus, as you said, of this year's COP was carbon dioxide removal, or CDR. Ernest Afori, a delegate from the Youth Climate Council Ghana, tells us why both emissions reduction and carbon removal are integral to curbing climate change.
So CDR is carbon dioxide removal, which I think is very essential to reaching net zero, the 1.5. 1.5 is not attainable or achievable without the twin targets, which is emission reduction and carbon removal. But when you look at the African region, what we mostly concentrate on is the emission reduction.
All right, Nate, can you break that down for us? Emission reduction, carbon dioxide removal, and how effective it is really in tackling climate change?
So one thing to talk about CDR is that there's a lot of different types. We have things like Climeworks, where we have sort of mechanical ways of pulling carbon out of the atmosphere. And we also have natural solutions like mangroves in the case of oceans and seagrasses. Trees are a form of carbon dioxide removal, and there's just sort of natural environmental processes that occur. There's kind of more mainstream things that we'd use in agriculture like biochar. So this is just pulling carbon out of the atmosphere and trying to sequester it permanently. And then carbon reduction, I think we're all pretty familiar with that at this point in 2023. We have renewables, we have nuclear, we have types of energy efficiency, we have things like the circular economy. So that's just preventing carbon emissions, sort of like Angelica's analogy about the leaky bathtub. But the one thing I would point out is that these CDR policies and programs are not all created equal. Some of them have a really high potential to adding more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, such as things like ocean fertilization. It's quite unproven whether just putting nutrients in the ocean and increasing algae to uptake that is going to be a net negative to carbon. So there needs to be a lot more research that's done before we just sort of begin all these different types of CDR projects. And that's something that the IUCN is really interested in understanding. That's what they were advocating for in the ocean panels at COP is, what are the real ocean CDR solutions and what are the ones that might actually set us back or just be a waste of money. So it's a complex space, and it's one that, the average person should be well informed on, as it's going to affect their lives very soon.
Angelica, as an energy reporter and analyst based in Taiwan, can you give us a sense of how much impetus there is right now, or how much talk there is of reducing emissions through CDRs and other means that probably haven't been instituted yet in most parts of the world?
My biggest takeaway from this COP, actually, and something that I've never been confronted so directly before, because when I'm in Taiwan, Taiwan's problem is in my face. I'm looking at how Taiwan can do better. But here at COP, everybody is looking at everybody else. And I have come face to face with a lot of representatives from the global South. And they have really brought home to me how unfair the situation is. I met with Congressman Marco Huangco of the Philippines. And in a panel, he said, we are not to blame, but we bear the brunt. And he's speaking for the global South countries when he say that. Because if you can imagine, the average person in the Philippines uses about 1/50th of the electricity of the average American. So the amount of carbon dioxide that each global South citizen is putting into the atmosphere is so tiny, especially when you consider the history. But if we do a fossil fuel phase out now, that is constraining the future economic growth, because Europe, United States, and I will include Taiwan in that, we already grew our economies through the historical release of those fossil fuels. So that historical inequity really rankles on the members of the global South.
And absolutely, Angelica, that is the crux of the argument against a complete phase out of fossil fuels, and it's that division of those countries that are still developing as opposed to those who are developed and who didn't have the limitations that are being imposed to these countries. And so, Nate, I'd like you to weigh in on that argument and explain that divide we're seeing, and whether it is a sustainable argument, particularly because at the end of the day, it's the whole world that's going to pay the price.
So the the UN sort of policy wonk term is common but differentiated responsibilities. So countries, higher income countries that have already developed should be the ones who are helping lower income countries transition to climate change. And I think this dichotomy of, oh, we need fossil fuels for growth, I would say that's an argument that you could make 10 years ago, but I think that's quite difficult to make in 2023. If we look at countries like China, they've built out a massive electric vehicle fleet. And part of the reason is that, that doesn't require the same oil demands as if you were to build out a gasoline petrol fleet. And there's ways of leapfrogging technology. I don't think that that's done as well as it should be, but I also don't think that we're in the same position where countries need to have fossil fuels to develop in the same ways. And some countries, if you look at ASEAN, like the Philippines and Thailand, they have much higher renewable energy generations than Malaysia and Indonesia, and that's because they have less fossil fuels. So I think it's going to be contextual in how they develop, but at the end of the day, we need to make sure that countries that have been left out of development through fossil fuels or because of, let's be real, the historical impact of colonization, then we need to make sure that those countries are properly compensated and supported because we do have one atmosphere.
Right. So I want to take you to another notable development at COP, and that was a declaration, which Angelica had mentioned earlier, by at least 20 countries tripling nuclear power capacity by 2050. Now, this means that nuclear energy could go from meeting 10% of the world's current electricity needs to almost a third within 25 years. Angelica, put that into perspective for us. You're a proponent of nuclear power. Tell us whether you think this is a viable option to tackle fossil fuel emissions.
The point is we haven't completely figured out how to do wind solar batteries and power the whole world. Nate rightly points out renewable energy has made fantastic gains and costed down so much, especially solar. It's incredibly impressive. And yet if you look at Germany, it still burns coal. It seems to me like we do need some sort of stability in the grid. That is the opinion that more and more countries are coming to, and that's driving this nuclear pledge. I don't know what's going to happen in the future, but I'm really glad for this pledge today because it gives nuclear a place at the table. I think, especially in previous COPs, nuclear has really been I don't know if this is still politically correct to say, the redheaded stepchild of the clean technologies. It's been shut out. And in fact, when we had an action this morning where I was dancing in a polar bear suit to push the message that net zero needs nuclear, we did get some people angrily shouting at us saying, no, we don't need nuclear, no nuclear energy, despite the fact that it is zero carbon. And carbon, the increased carbon in the atmosphere is what we need to solve the problem.
Firstly, Angelica, I'd love to get some footage of you in that polar bear suit. But I do want to take it into Nate to talk about, is this the viable answer to reducing fossil fuels, given Angelica's concern that this is not, it's got to be looked at proportionally?
Yeah, I mean, the IEA says that electricity consumption is going to at least triple by 2050. So that means that nuclear, based on that pledge, would hold its own proportion. And I think that we should all welcome nuclear energy. I don't think there's anything wrong with clean and stable baseload power. I don't agree with the characterization that it's been shut out of previous COPs. I think it's always been included in energy modeling. It's always been a part of certain countries' INDCs. I don't feel personally that it's stigmatized as such. People are allowed to talk about it, but we don't have the same financial mechanisms like PPAs, renewable energy certificates that nuclear has. There hasn't been the same corporate push. Things like RE100 explicitly do not include nuclear. So it's interesting to see how nuclear shows up at COP this year, and I'm curious to see how that's going to change over time. I personally don't feel a particular need to advocate for nuclear because it has strong support from global governments and in many cases the military. But I'm happy to see it at the table and be one of the many electricity decarbonization options out there for countries to choose from.
Right. And speaking of diversification, it's not just a climate issue for Taiwan in particular. Chao-Wei Chow, Research Director at NGO Taiwan Climate Action Network, tells us about areas of concern that go beyond the environment.
But as a whole, we have to view the climate change issue not as a kind of like a new the national security label. But in the other side, we have to see the climate change issue, dealing with the climate change issue is a human right basis. Like this COP, there was also some declaration about the climate change and the health. In Taiwan, we always think the health is a priority. We want to talk about that, but we forgot the climate change is a new threat to our public health.
Angelica, given what we heard, can you give us a bigger picture look as to why Taiwan really needs to take this seriously and really needs to take action right now?
Taiwan is a major tech-producing nation, and we are responsible for our supply chain. If we can't produce the clean electricity to make the chips and laptops, that would hurt our economy. Of course, I would wish that Taiwan, just like every single other nation on the world, should also feel an obligation to come together and solve this collective action problem for all of us. I would turn the question around, Divya. I wouldn't say, why is it so important for Taiwan to cooperate in this? I think it's important for the world to include Taiwan. I think it's important for the world to bring Taiwan to the table, because it is hard to negotiate with somebody that you've excluded. And I'm feeling that at this COP.
And Nate, what would be your biggest takeaway from this year's event?
My biggest takeaway is that we have more people than ever going to COP, and I think that's a great thing. We've made the tent much larger than it's ever been. We have many more diverse voices, corporate, human, NGO, academic, even AI and otherwise. And this to me is a major turning point. Hosting it in Dubai, in the Gulf, really shows people, what the heat and pollution is going to look like. And I hope this drives home the message that we need to commit and do more. And this really is going to require quite radical change if we're going to stop climate change.
Right, and with that we come to the end of the show. Thank you to our guests, Nate Maynard and Angelica Oung, for sharing your observations from COP28. And for our viewers everywhere, it has been good to have your company. If you've enjoyed today's episode or have anything you'd like to add to the dialogue, do join the conversation on our social media. And remember, stay informed, stay engaged, and stay connected.